Hello and welcome to my channel. Another colored pencil portrait. This time it's Julie Andrews, best known for Mary Poppins, an older movie. Let's get to it. The pencils I'm going to be using are Faber-Castell Polychromos colored pencils, and I'm going to be using them on a 1000 grit sandpaper. So colored pencils on sandpaper, the usual combination I've been using recently. I've already done a number of portraits in this technique. I worked around the sketch here with some lighter pencils because my background is going to be mostly plain blue with a slight gradient getting a little bit lighter at the bottom. Now I'm going over the sketch with some slightly darker colors. I obtained the original sketch by using the tracing method. I like to use a combination of tracing and freehand in a lot of my portraits. That is what works fastest and is probably the most fun to do. Now I'm moving on to drawing some of the details. I did the eye on the left, put in some highlights, some catch lights in the eye using the white colored pencil. And now I'm going to do a similar thing with the other eye. So here in this stage I just decided to put in some of the darkest bits, like for example the eyelashes, the corners of the mouth, the nostrils. I just want to have those in place so that once I start shading the place it's easier for me to navigate, and so that I don't lose the original proportions that I created with the sketch. Now I'm working on the background, putting down some of these blues. I'm going to be using a combination of two blues mostly. It's going to be the light ultramarine and the sky blue. I laid down the light ultramarine first because that one is a little bit darker, and then I'm going to be layering over that using the sky blue color. The sky blue color is a little bit lighter, and I'm also going to be doing a bit of blending with a brush. So when you want to cover larger areas with colored pencil, it works a little bit better on sanded paper than on regular paper, but again the problem is that they are not as good as for covering large areas as, for example, pastel pencils. So that's something to keep in mind, and it's a little bit more difficult to achieve these gradients and to avoid having any texture. Blending tools can help, but there are limitations to that, because when you use brushes like this one, and I'm using a flat bristle brush for that, when you use a blending tool like that, it can reveal a little bit of the background color, and if the background color is a little bit too dull or too dark, that may work a little bit against you. But here I didn't really mind too much, because I didn't really have a specific color in mind. I just wanted the background to be a little bit lighter and kind of bluish, and I wanted some sort of a gradient going from a little bit darker blue at the top, getting a bit lighter at the bottom. So a fairly simple background this time. And now I'm moving on to this hat, this large hat, which is mostly white, but I'm going to use lighter colors at the top and some slightly darker colors here at the bottom, because that's the part of the hat, the surface of the hat, which is facing down, facing away from the light source. And here at the top I'm going to be using a little bit more of the white colored pencil, which is of course the lightest pencil that I have. And I'm going to be blending that with some other lighter colors, like for example the light cold gray. And at the bottom, on the inner side of the hat, I used some darker grays and even a black colored pencil for some of the shadow areas. I added a touch of some warmer colors as well, but I mostly used some grays for that inner portion, inner part of the hat. There are some details on the hat as well as the dress, as you will see later, that I couldn't really make out in my reference. I'm going to put my reference in the description if you want to check it out. I'm going to put a link there. If you want to examine it a little bit, I kind of simplified certain things and tried mostly to focus on the face as I normally do when I draw portraits. It doesn't really matter whether I draw charcoal portraits or colored pencil portraits. That's what I usually tend to do. Neither of these portraits in this colored pencil series is a vignette. I normally like doing vignettes. These are not going to be vignettes, but I'm going to be simplifying both the clothes and the backgrounds wherever I can. The hair is not going to be black. I put down some black first because I want to establish some darker areas first, and then on top of that I'm putting down some lighter tones, mostly the browns, the walnut brown and the more reddish burnt sienna, as well as some others for the highlights. And now I'm going to be working on the skin tone and the face. I'm going to be shading the face and defining the shape and the topography of the face. For the darker bits, I'm actually going to be using this orangey dull color, which is called Sanguine in the Faber-Castell range. That's one of the things that I use for the darker parts of the face. And for the mid-tone, I'm going to be using the Cinnamon, which is what I'm using now. The cinnamon colored pencil is something like a medium flesh tone, and then on top of that I'm going to be using an even lighter colored pencil, but this one works pretty well for faces in most cases, and I usually combine it either with this Sanguine or maybe sometimes with a little bit of ochre and some others, burnt sienna and maybe even some other browns. But on top of it I usually put the light beige red, which is kind of like a pinkish lighter color. Not exactly pinkish, it's a little bit warmer than that, I think. But it's a very light color that works well with cinnamon when I draw faces, or at least I feel it does. I'm not really an expert on colors, as you know. Most of my drawings were black and white, and I'm still kind of experimenting with this technique and with this medium. But I do like using colored pencils on sanded paper because it really allows you to do a lot of things that are either very difficult or nearly impossible to do on regular paper. So I'm working around the eye here, trying to define its shape and do a little bit of shading around it. In addition to the Faber-Castell black colored pencil, I also use the Koh-i-Noor silky black pencils. These are a little bit darker. And for the lightest parts of the forehead area, I even used a little bit of ivory colored pencil, which is even lighter. And I'm going to use touches of that on some other parts of the face, like for example on the cheekbone area and on the nose, but I'm going to use that very, very sparingly, because that's one of the things you should probably try to do. You should try to use your lightest lights and your darkest darks sparingly if you can. It doesn't always have to be that way, but it helps when you establish a nice range of value and then use those touches of your brightest and your darkest colors sparingly, and that makes their usage all the more effective. There are also some nice shadows on the face, like for example a shadow under the nose, the shadow on the right side of the face. When I say the right side of the face, I mean our right, her left. So I'm going to try to keep that darker, and I'm going to try to retain that contrast while I'm shading, because sometimes during the shading process you can overblend or overlayer, and sometimes you lose a bit of that contrast. But I think those larger contrasts are very, very important if you want to create an illusion of volume and depth, and also create likeness in whichever portrait you're drawing, because you want to try to explain the shape of the face, and you can't really do that without establishing those larger relationships between areas of lighter and darker value. The teeth aren't completely white, even though they appear that way. The camera doesn't capture all of the nuances about I did use a lot of white colored pencil on them, and I also added some small highlights on the lips as well to make them a little bit more glossy. And now I'm adding some lighter touches to the nose. The nose appears a little bit wider, and at the tip, because it's a round part of the face at the tip, we're going to have a slightly lighter area, like a small highlight. Not quite as strong as the one in the eyes, a little bit more subdued, but a highlight nonetheless. I'm gradually moving on to the right side of the face, working on the eyes still here, putting in some other tones in addition to the white, to make those whites of the eye look more natural, because an eye is a round object, so I need to add a little bit of shadow around the corners of the eyes and under the upper eyelid and things like that. Also refining the shape of the eyebrows, the upper and lower eyelashes, and the general shape of this eye socket area, and the transition between the eye sockets and the forehead and the nose, because this is probably the most important part of the face when it comes to capturing likeness. The actress here, Julie Andrews, has a very nice bone structure of the face, and strong cheekbones, and a nice chin, and some dimples and some wrinkles on the cheeks, with a wide smile. Didn't really watch many of her movies, to be honest. I probably know her best for one of the more recent roles, where she was quite a bit older, The Princess Diaries. But she's a classic Hollywood actress, I suppose. She starred in some of the famous older movies. There's a nice shadow here on the neck, being cast from left to right. And now I'm going to be moving slowly onto the dress. That's going to be another tricky bit, because there are a lot of details that I don't really understand, and I'm not an expert on clothes anyway, so I'm going to have to simplify and approximate a lot. Here I did a little bit more of the background on the right, and just did a bit more work on the ear, and also did a bit of refining on the face itself, putting down some refining touches on the face, using mostly lighter colored pencils. That light beige red, I used that to lighten up some parts of the face, because I felt that it felt a little bit too dark overall. But I used some other colors as well during this process. It's a process that requires a little bit of time and patience if you want to get it to look right. So it pays off if you want to just give it an extra half an hour just to work on the face a little bit longer. Now I'm cleaning up the edges around the shoulders and the arms, and I'm going to be working on the dress. The dress appears mostly white with some transparent bits. It's kind of like a ruffle dress with some frills, and there are some floral patterns around the shoulders here and elsewhere. These are going to appear a little bit lighter than the rest of the dress because they're kind of popping out. I want them to pop out. I don't have to get these shapes exactly right. So like I said, I will try to simplify a little bit. I'm also using some of the colors that I use for the skin. Mostly on the shoulder area. I'm going to use that on the chest area as well. So I want to make it look like we can see a little bit of the skin through that thin dress. Or maybe the color is coming from some other parts of the dress. It doesn't really matter. Now this part here is a little bit complex. I can only try to sort of imitate and simplify the stuff I see because I can't make out all of the details. And I don't really feel like being bothered too much with the clothes. It's never been one of my favorite things to draw. So I'm first going to block it in by putting in the colors that I see in those areas, going from darker ones to the lighter ones. And then maybe I'm going to go back and do a bit of refining of the shapes that I can discern and add a few shadows here and there. But I'm kind of hoping, because I'm going to simplify this, I'm kind of hoping that this part of the portrait will not be grabbing the attention of the viewers. I'm hoping that the attention of the viewers will mostly go to the portrait. Now, like I said, I'm doing a series of portraits, and I've already done a number of them on my channel. And the paper size is a little bit smaller than usual, about 5 times 9 inches or so, I'm not really sure. But the size of the portraits themselves, the size of the head or the face that I'm drawing on that piece of paper tends to vary. Some of them are a little bit bigger, others a little bit smaller. The reason why that is so is because of the composition. I always have to try to examine my reference photos, and I gotta try to see which parts of the body I will include, which ones I will omit, how much of the face I want to show, and how big the face is going to be. So these are some of the decisions that I need to make in advance before I start working on the sketch and laying down the sketch. I need to work out the composition. So like I said, this middle part here around the neck is kind of like a bunch of frills on a ruffle dress. And I'm going to have those on the other side as well. I'm trying to vary the amount of light as well as the amount of shadow here, so that this part of the dress would feel like it's popping out a little bit, like it's protruding a bit. And because the dress is a fairly light color, I'm assuming that it's mostly white, but because much of it is in the shadow, I can't use the white colored pencil, so I use the next best thing, which is very light, but at the same time not as light as white, which is the cold grey. And I'm using that for some of the midtones and the shadow areas. Here I did a little bit more of the background. On the right also did a bit of blending, just trying to wrap things up with the background so that I could just move on with the finishing touches on the face and the body. But I gotta make that background fairly smooth. I don't want it to have too much texture. If you like my videos, if you like my content, don't forget to subscribe and give me a like. I have plenty of other videos. Whether you like charcoal or colored pencil or some other techniques, you will find lots of portraits, landscapes, wildlife, anything you like. But right now, as I've already explained, I'm doing a series of portraits, and I know I could be working a little bit faster and producing a bit more of them, more than just one per week, but I suppose I'm doing my best as the time allows. Just finishing the details on the right side of this hat here. This part is in the shadow. I'm going to make it a little bit darker overall. And once those details are done, and once I'm mostly happy with the way the portrait looks, I'm putting my signature over her right shoulder, and that's it. The drawing is now finished, I think. If you want to see longer videos and more content, then you should go to my Patreon. But that would be all for this one. I want to thank you for watching, and I'm going to see you in the next one. Bye for now.